The next question is, why does Canada accept refugees if we have our own problems such as homeless, unemployment, etc.?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a few answers to that question. One is simply that sometimes you have to keep more than one ball in the air, and there are legitimate problems that have to be responded to, and you can't wait on a response to one problem in order to act on something that you can act on now. And so admitting refugees is something that we can do. Many people coming to Canada as refugees are going to settle in and find employment and become part of the solution to some of the other ongoing problems here in Canada too. So I think it would be a mistake to see this simply as a problem that's being taken on like any other problem. People who are coming to Canada as refugees are going to be able to contribute to be part of the solution once they've integrated here into Canada. So that's part of it, and part of it is that I think there's a pressing moral obligation. It's one that that Canada has not always done the best job of living up to. Earlier this week in Parliament, all other shenanigans aside, there was a very serious apology by the Prime Minister for the Komagata Maru incident, which were people trying to come to Canada because they were fearful of persecution at home, and indeed when they returned home, because Canada sent them away, some of them were shot coming off the boat, and many others were put in jail. So I think that is rightfully something that Canada should have apologized for a long time ago. And I think if we want to not continue to make the mistakes of the past and be here, 50 or 60 years from now, making a similar apology, bringing refugees in from Syria is an important thing to do. And I think there's, I would say, if you want another reason, I mean, Canada has not been innocent in the conflict in Syria. We were running air raids. We heard earlier about the family whose mother was killed in an air raid. Canada was running missions like that, and it has displaced families. And I think there's a moral obligation there to recognize that at least part of that is a consequence of Canada's deliberate acts in Syria, and that we have an obligation to help those who are now out of a home and missing family because of actions that we took in the area. It would be wrong simply to close our doors to them.
If I can just chime in on that as well, I think, speaking from a personal note, I think even though Canada is somewhat isolated geographically, we might not have the same sort of so-called immigrant crisis that is happening in parts of Europe, but I think for me as an individual, if I start to see people who may live halfway across the world just simply as human beings, right? Those people are just as important as my neighbors across the street. And I think that's, at least for me, that's where you need to have a bit of a paradigm shift in the way we think about the other people that we don't know, who, whatever, right? We need to start seeing people just simply as our fellow human beings. And I think once we start to see that, start to shift that little bit in our brain and understand that those people across the ocean are just as important as our neighbors across the street, that kind of attitude and that kind of worldview, I think, goes a long way to help sort of build attitudes of peace and attitudes of belonging. And many of us probably sitting in the crowd today on this panel have come to Canada as refugees, or our grandparents have come to Canada as refugees. And so if we put ourselves in the shoes of those kids that we saw on the video, wouldn't we all want someone to offer support for us? And I think we can all sit here probably and say like, well, none of us will ever be refugees because we live in this safe place. But I think in a bit of a different context, if we ask the people of Fort McMurray, Alberta, if they ever thought they would be refugees, and in a sense they are kind of like refugees, those who have lost their homes, right? And so I think when we put ourselves in other people's shoes, we can sort of say, yes, this is the right thing to do, and as Daniel said, it's a moral thing to do as well.